The wind did not howl through the pine so much as it screamed, a living force scouring the warmth from the frozen earth of the sanctuary, yet in the lee of a fallen hemlock, a defiance of nature was taking place. Banner, a massive Siberian husky with eyes like chipped ice and a history of profound loneliness, lay curled in the snow, his thick coat becoming a shield against the biting gale. Tucked desperately against the heat of his belly, invisible to the sweeping drone of the storm, was a scrap of copper fur no larger than a human hand, a dying fox kit named Siku. They were not merely huddling, they were entrenched in the beginnings of a hollow, a primitive structure of survival that would one day become a legend on this property. The snow had buried the world in white silence, erasing the boundaries between predator and prey, leaving only two heartbeats synchronized in the dark. By all biological laws, the wolf in the dog should have snapped the fragile spine of the intruder, or at the very least, ignored its fading pulse in favor of self-preservation. Instead, Banner dipped his heavy head, his wet nose nudge-checking the kit's shallow respiration, his massive paws acting as walls to block the wind. It was an impossible tableau, a frozen moment where instinct surrendered to something far more ancient and mysterious, raising the singular, terrifying question of whether compassion alone could generate enough heat to keep a fading life from slipping into the eternal cold. To understand why a creature bred to pull sleds was currently acting as a living incubator for a wild animal that technically shouldn't exist in his world, we have to rewind 48 hours, before the storm, before the silence, to a routine patrol that changed everything. The silence of the sanctuary was usually Elena's favorite sound, a heavy, muffled blanket that separated her from the chaotic world she had left behind in the city, but lately, that silence had begun to feel less like peace and more like isolation. As a wildlife rehabilitation specialist, Elena was accustomed to the brutal mathematics of survival, where empathy was a professional liability and attachment was a fast track to burnout. She was 34, tired, and carrying the heavy weight of compassion fatigue that plagues everyone in her field, her only constant companion being Banner, the rescued dog who shadowed her steps with a neurotic devotion that mirrored her own need for connection. It was a Tuesday evening, the sky bruising purple with the threat of the incoming freeze, when they set out for the perimeter check along the northern fence line. Banner was usually a creature of predictable habits, trotting exactly 3 feet ahead, stopping only to mark the occasional stump, but today his gait was broken, his rhythm agitated. He stopped abruptly near a cluster of dense brambles, his ears swiveling like radar dishes tracking a signal Elena couldn't hear. "Come on, Banner," she had muttered, the cold seeping through her thermal layers, eager to get back to the warmth of the cabin and the stack of paperwork waiting on her desk. But the dog refused to move, his body rigid, a low, vibrating whine building in his throat that was distinct from his usual demand for treats or attention. This was the sound of distress. He looked back at her, his mismatched eyes wide and urgent, then plunged chest deep into the snowbank, ignoring her command to heel. Elena felt a spike of adrenaline cut through her fatigue, the instinctual fear that he had found a trap or a carcass, something dangerous or dead. She waded in after him, the snow crust breaking against her shins, cursing the failing light. When she reached him, Banner wasn't tearing at something, he was standing over it, his posture protective, almost reverent. Elena dropped to her knees, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and brushed away the dusting of fresh powder to reveal the source of Banner's fixation. It looked less like an animal and more like a discarded rag, a tiny, skeletal fox kit, eyes crusted shut, its body stiff with the advanced stages of hypothermia. The mother was nowhere to be seen, likely a victim of the road 3 miles south or the harsh winter that had culled the weeks ago. Protocol was clear, written in bold letters in the handbook she had memorized: nature takes its course, and bringing a wild predator, even a dying one, into a domestic space was a violation of safety regulations and biological wisdom. The kit was unresponsive, its heart rate likely plummeting into fatal bradycardia. Elena reached out, her gloved finger touching the kit's flank, expecting the cold rigidity of death, but she felt a faint, erratic flutter. It was the whisper of a life refusing to be extinguished. Banner nudged her arm, then licked the kit's frozen ear, a gesture of tenderness that shattered Elena's professional detachment. In that moment, the logical, scientific part of her brain screamed that this was a hopeless case, a waste of resources, a heartbreak waiting to happen. But looking at Banner, who had been discarded by his previous owners for being too much work, and looking at this broken creature that the forest had rejected, she made a decision that defied her training. She scooped the kit up, shocked by how weightless it felt, essentially just bones and fur held together by the cold. She tucked the animal inside her heavy parka, pressing it against her core, feeling the terrifying chill of its body seep through her layers. The run back to the main lodge was a blur of panic and snow, Banner pacing her every step, barking softly as if to encourage them to move faster. Bursting into the sterile light of the treatment room, Elena laid the kit on the stainless steel examination table, the metal cold and unforgiving against the soft copper fur. She moved with the muscle memory of a trauma nurse, stripping off her gloves, grabbing the heating pads, the warm saline fluids, the glucose solution. Banner stood on his hind legs, paws on the edge of the table, watching with an intensity that unnerved her. He wasn't just curious, he was supervising. The silence of the room was broken only by the hum of the heater and the ragged, shallow gasps of the kit as the warmth began to shock its system. Elena worked for hours, fighting the urge to stop and cry, fighting the grim reality that she was likely just prolonging the inevitable. She warmed the fluids, injected the subcutaneous hydration, and massaged the tiny, unmoving chest, waiting for a sign, any sign, that the spirit hadn't fled the body. By the time she stepped back, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the chill in the room, the kit was stable but critical, hovering on that razor-thin line between existence and memory. She pulled up the diagnostic charts, ran the numbers based on weight, temperature, and dehydration levels, and stared at the grim calculation staring back at her. She looked down at the tiny, unconscious form, then at Banner, who had refused to leave the room and was now lying under the table, his chin resting on the metal crossbar, eyes fixed upward. Elena let out a long, shaky breath, the weight of her decision settling onto her shoulders like a physical load. Because the medical assessment was unambiguous and brutal, the kit had less than a 10% chance of surviving the night. The vigil began not with action, but with a stillness that felt suffocating, the only sound in the room the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator and the wind rattling the window panes like a thief trying to gain entry. Elena sat on a stool, her spine aching, watching the rise and fall of the fox's ribs, which were so fragile they seemed made of bird bones, while Banner remained stationed beneath the table, a silent sentry whose refusal to sleep became the only anchor Elena had to hope. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the changing digital numbers on the clock and the periodic checks of Siku's temperature, which remained stubbornly low until, in a moment of desperate improvisation, Elena opened the crate door and allowed the Husky to press his nose against the warm towel wrapping the kit. It was a violation of every sterile protocol she knew, but as Banner exhaled a long, warm breath over the shivering scrap of fur, the heart rate monitor, which had been erratic and weak, smoothed into a stronger, steady rhythm, as if the dog's vitality was being osmosed through the metal grate. Dawn broke not with a burst of sunlight but with a grey lifting of the dark, revealing a world buried in white, and in that pale illumination, the miracle occurred. Siku took a breath that didn't rattle, his tiny ears twitched, and for the first time, he slept not out of exhaustion, but out of peace. The recovery that followed was less a medical progression and more a series of small, hard-won victories that defied the textbooks. Within 3 days, Siku's eyes opened, revealing irises of startling clarity, not the dull glaze of the dying but the bright, intelligent spark of a survivor. The first time Elena introduced the bottle, it was Banner who nudged Siku's flank with his nose, prompting the kit to latch on, and as Siku drank, his paws kneading the air, Banner licked the milk from the kit's chin with a tenderness that made Elena's chest ache with a confusing mix of pride and worry. She documented everything, her journal filling with observations of a dynamic that shouldn't exist, the way Banner modified his behavior, dampening his boisterous energy to accommodate the kit's fragility, and the way Siku, as his strength returned, didn't seek the dark corners of the room like a wild animal but instead wobbled on unsteady legs toward the warmth of the dog's fur. By the time the snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath, the David and Goliath dynamic had shifted from nursing to play, a chaotic ballet of fur and teeth where Siku, now a lanky adolescent with oversized ears and a mischievous glint in his eye, would ambush the 100-pound Husky from behind the sofa. Banner would collapse with theatrical exaggeration, allowing the fox to pin him, emitting a soft, rolling woo sound that was neither bark nor howl, a specific language developed solely for this audience of one. The house, once a silo of professional isolation, was now alive with the clicking of claws and the strange, chittering laughter of a fox who had seemingly forgotten, or perhaps never knew, that he was supposed to be wild. But biology is a patient ghost, and as spring turned to summer, the instinct to build, to dig, to claim territory, awoke in Siku with an intensity that could not be contained by 4 walls. Elena watched from the porch as the two of them tackled the earth in the expansive outdoor enclosure, not digging aimlessly, but with architectural purpose. Siku would break the ground with his sharp claws, and Banner would use his massive paws to clear the debris, a seamless assembly line of excavation. They weren't just digging a hole, they were constructing a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a complex tunnel system lined with stolen doormats and chewed-up toys, a physical manifestation of their shared life. Yet, shadows were lengthening in the corners of this idyll, for Siku was reaching sexual maturity, and the gentle nips of puppyhood were sharpening into the testing bites of an adult predator. There was a dusk where Siku, agitated by a scent on the wind, snapped at Banner with real aggression, drawing a drop of blood from the husky's ear, and though Banner simply turned his head and offered a calming signal, Elena felt the cold dread of inevitability settling in her gut. She knew the regulations, she knew that a wild animal, no matter how acclimated, eventually answers a call that human love cannot silence, and she began to prepare herself for the heartbreak of separation, drafting the transfer papers that would send Siku to a fox-specific facility where he would live without his dog. Then came the storm, a late-season blizzard that defied meteorological models, slamming into the sanctuary with hurricane-force winds that screamed like banshees and turned the world into a blinding vortex of white. The power died instantly, plunging the cabin into darkness, and the sound of a falling tree splintering the perimeter fence of the enclosure tore through the noise like a gunshot. Elena scrambled with her flashlight, heart hammering against her ribs, but when the beam cut through the swirling snow, the enclosure was empty. Siku, spooked by the crash, had bolted into the whiteout. Banner was frantic, throwing his body against the back door, his howls tearing at Elena's resolve, forcing her into the impossible choice between safety and love. With hands shaking so hard she could barely work the latch, she clipped the lead off the husky's collar, whispered a plea to the wind, and opened the door, watching her only companion disappear into the killing cold to find the creature that instinct said he should hunt. The next hour was an eternity of regret, Elena fighting her way through the drifts, screaming their names until her throat was raw, the visibility reduced to the length of her own arm. She found them not by sight, but by the absence of wind, huddled in the lee of the super den they had built together, the structure having survived the falling timber that had crushed the fence. The beam of her flashlight revealed a reprise of their very first meeting. Banner was curled in the snow, his body a protective crescent, and tucked deep within his fur, completely shielded from the storm, was Siku. The fox had had every opportunity to run, to disappear into the forest that was his birthright, but when the world fell apart, he had chosen the dog, he had chosen his family. The realization brought Elena to her knees in the snow, weeping not from the cold but from the sheer, overwhelming proof that love is a force that transcends DNA. The aftermath of the storm brought not just repairs, but a new resolve. Elena tore up the transfer papers and instead filed for a permanent educational permit, waging a bureaucratic war she refused to lose, armed with the documentation of a bond that was clearly essential to both animals' survival. The permit was granted on a grey Tuesday, turning the temporary into the permanent, and the sanctuary adapted, the fences strengthened, the super den reinforced and integrated into the landscape as a permanent monument to their collaboration. Years blurred into a peaceful rhythm, Siku becoming an ambassador for his species, teaching visitors about the complexity of emotional life in animals, always with Banner watching from a respectful distance. His job as guardian never finished. Siku developed a vocalization, a haunting, melodic trill that he sang only when Banner was near, a fox song that became the soundtrack of Elena's life, a daily reminder of the bridge they had built. Time, however, is the one antagonist that cannot be defeated, and the muzzle of the husky turned sugar white, his steps slowing, while the fox's movements lost their frantic speed, settling into a dignified trot. In the end, it wasn't a tragedy but a twilight, a softening of the days until they were two old souls resting in the sun, bodies touching, always touching. Looking at them silhouetted against the fire of a setting sun, Elena realized they had taught her more about humanity than any person ever had, that we are not defined by what we are born as, but by who we choose to hold onto in the storm. Their story wasn't just about a dog and a fox, it was a testament to the fact that in a world obsessed with categories and divisions, connection is the only survival strategy that matters. As the screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of the wind and a soft, answering woo, we are left with the question of what walls we might be able to tear down in our own lives if we were only brave enough to trust the enemy. The turning point was not a singular explosion of health, but a slow, wondrous unfurling, like a fern opening in the spring thaw. beginning with the day Siku's eyes finally unsealed. They were not the murky blue of a puppy but a piercing, amber gold that seemed to hold an ancient intelligence, and the moment those eyes focused, they did not lock onto Elena, the provider of food, but onto Banner, the provider of life. The first physical contact was tentative, a quiet investigation that defied every rule of the wild, as the husky lowered his massive head to the floor where the kit was gaining strength on a heating pad. Banner began to clean the kit with methodical, rhythmic licks, his rough tongue stimulating the kit's circulation, grooming the matted fur until it fluffed into a soft halo of copper. Siku, instead of cowering from the predator's scent, leaned into the grooming, emitting a soft, purring vibration that rattled in his small chest. The feeding routine became a three-party operation where Elena held the bottle, but Banner dictated the pace, nudging Siku's flank if he stopped drinking too soon, or whining softly at Elena if the milk flow seemed too fast. Elena found herself documenting behavior that no textbook could explain, filling pages of her journal with the observation that Banner wasn't acting like a dog with a toy, but like a wolf with a cub, his entire demeanor softening, his neurotic pacing replaced by a stoic, watchful stillness. As the weeks melted the last of the snow, Siku's stumbling, drunken walks turned into coordinated trots, and the recovery room could no longer contain the energy of a creature designed to run. The dynamic shifted from nursing to a boisterous, unlikely friendship that turned the living room into a theater of joy, highlighting the comedic and touching contrast between the 100-pound sled dog and the 5-pound fox. They developed a game that Elena called David and Goliath, where Siku would ambush Banner from behind the sofa, launching himself at the husky's hocks with a high-pitched kek-kek-kek sound. Banner would play his part with Oscar-worthy commitment, collapsing onto the rug with a heavy thud as if felled by a mighty blow, allowing the tiny fox to conquer him, standing triumphantly on the dog's ribcage. It was during these play sessions that they developed a private language, a series of vocalizations that Elena had never heard from either species before. Banner softened his bark into a low, rumbling woo that wouldn't frighten the kit, and Siku responded with a specific chittering trill he used only for the dog, never for Elena. The isolation that had defined Elena's life at the sanctuary began to dissolve, not because she was seeing more people, but because her home was suddenly filled with a complex, vibrant emotional life that made the empty spaces feel full. Yet, as Siku grew, shedding his puppy fuzz for the sleek, dark-legged coat of an adult red fox, Elena couldn't ignore the biological reality that he was not a dog. He began to cache food under the rug, he marked the furniture, and his play became sharper, faster, driven by a wild engine that was revving up. When spring fully broke, turning the sanctuary into a riot of green mud and blooming wildflowers, Elena opened the access to the large outdoor enclosure, introducing the next phase of their shared existence, the construction of the magical building. It started with Siku digging near the root system of an old oak tree, his black paws moving like pistons, sending dirt flying in frantic arcs. Banner, observing this, didn't just watch, he joined in, not with the chaotic digging of a dog looking for a bone, but with a precise, collaborative effort, using his wider paws to clear the spoil pile Siku created. They worked in shifts, a mesmerizing display of interspecies engineering, excavating a complex tunnel system that went far deeper than a simple den. They began to furnish it, dragging items from the house, an old fleece blanket, a chew toy, a gardening glove Elena had lost weeks ago, down into the cool, dark earth. This wasn't just a hole, it was a home, a super den that represented a shared investment in their future, a place where they would disappear for hours, sleeping curled together underground, safe from the heat of the sun and the eyes of the world. It was a golden season, a time of suspended reality where it seemed they could just exist in this paradise forever, but nature has a way of demanding its due. The shadow fell over them as summer waned and Siku hit adolescence, the hormonal surge waking up instincts that had been dormant, turning the playful kit into a restless, moody creature. The nocturnal restlessness began first, Siku pacing the fence line at 3 a.m., staring into the dark forest with a hunger that kibble couldn't satisfy. Then came the nip. During a bout of wrestling, Siku didn't inhibit his bite, his sharp teeth tearing the skin of Banner's muzzle. The husky yelped, backing away in confusion, blood welling on his white snout, and while he didn't retaliate, the air in the room shifted instantly from play to tension. Elena cleaned the wound, her hands shaking, realizing that the gentle truce was fraying under the pressure of biology. Siku was a wild animal, and keeping him as a pet was becoming dangerous for Banner and cruel for the fox. The regulations she was bound by as a licensed rehabilitator were clear: if an animal cannot be released, it must be transferred to a suitable facility or euthanized, and keeping a fox with a domestic dog was a violation of safety protocols. She began the heartbreaking administrative work, drafting emails to fox sanctuaries, staring at Siku through the window as he paced, looking less like a friend and more like a prisoner. The decision was taken out of her hands by the sky itself, which bruised a deep, violent purple one late November afternoon, heralding a freak cyclonic storm that the weather radio warned would be historic. The wind hit the sanctuary like a physical blow, screaming through the valley, stripping shingles from the roof and turning the trees into bending, snapping whips. The power died with a metallic pop, plunging the cabin into a cold, grey gloom, and amidst the roar of the gale, a terrifying crash shook the ground. A massive hemlock had shattered the perimeter fence of the enclosure. Elena grabbed her heavy flashlight and fought the door open, the wind nearly ripping it from the hinges, screaming for Banner and Siku. Banner was there, pressed against the siding, barking frantically at the gaping hole in the fence, but the enclosure was empty. Siku was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Elena's veins as she clipped a lead onto Banner, intending to drag him inside for safety, but the dog was immovable, planting his feet, his eyes locked on the dark, swirling chaos of the forest. He looked at her, then at the woods, and gave a single, demanding bark. In that split second, Elena had to choose between the safety she was sworn to uphold and the bond she had witnessed. She looked at the dog, unclipped the lead, and whispered, "Find him." Banner vanished into the storm, a white ghost swallowed by the grey fury, leaving Elena alone in the howling dark to wait, terrified that she had just sentenced her only companion to death. The hours that followed were an agony of pacing and prayer, the storm raging with a violence that made the cabin shudder, until finally, around dawn, the wind dropped to a sullen moan. Elena ventured out into the wreckage, the air biting cold, climbing over fallen branches to reach the enclosure, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't find them in the woods, she found them in the one place that had held strong. The super den, their engineering marvel, had survived the falling tree, its entrance partially blocked but intact. Shining her light down the tunnel, she saw the reflection of eyes, not two, but four. Deep in the earth, insulated from the freezing wind, Banner was curled around Siku, his body heat acting as a furnace for the fox, just as he had done on that first night. Siku, who could have run, who had the entire forest open to him, had chosen to retreat to the home he built with his friend. The rescue was a quiet, holy thing, Elena coaxing them out into the pale morning light, witnessing the undeniable truth that their bond was not a temporary anomaly but a permanent survival strategy. The realization hardened her resolve: she could not, would not, separate them. The weeks that followed involved a different kind of fight, not against nature, but against bureaucracy. Elena compiled a dossier of evidence, videos of their cooperative digging, logs of their grooming, the narrative of the storm, and applied for a special educational permit that would allow Siku to remain as a permanent ambassador animal, arguing that his bond with Banner was essential to his psychological welfare. It was a long shot, a legal battle fought with paperwork and passion, but when the stamped approval finally arrived, it felt like a second birth. The sanctuary adapted to this new reality, the fences were reinforced, the super den was protected with a weatherproof overhang, and Siku was officially retired from the wild track, becoming a permanent resident. The year settled into a rhythm of profound peace, the frantic energy of youth replaced by the deep, comfortable groove of routine. Siku became a local legend, an ambassador who taught visitors about the complexities of animal emotion, often seen trotting alongside Banner on leash walks, a sight that stopped traffic and opened hearts. Siku developed a fox song, a vocalization he saved for the evenings, a high, melodic trill that he would sing while grooming Banner's ears, a sound that became the soundtrack of the sanctuary. They aged together, the black on Siku's legs frosting with grey, Banner's eyes clouding slightly with cataracts, but their connection never wavered. They were two halves of a whole, navigating the world in tandem. In the end, the story concluded not with a dramatic exit, but with a quiet, golden sunset that seemed to stretch on forever. Elena sat on the porch, watching them resting in the long grass, the old husky lying on his side, the old fox curled into the curve of the dog's belly, their breathing synchronized in sleep. It was a tableau of perfect, impossible love, a predator and prey who had rewritten the rules of their existence to save each other. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the sanctuary they had built, the message was clear and resounding: in a harsh world, the wildest, bravest thing you can do is choose to love someone who doesn't belong to your pack. The screen fades on this image of unity, leaving the audience with the lingering, transformative thought that perhaps we, too, can build something magical if we are willing to bridge the divide.